Welcome to Green and Gold FC. I am joined by Adam Field, a sports scientist, to try and get to the bottom of why are Aussies so injury prone when they go to Europe, and is there anything we can do about it? So, how are you going, Adam?
Hi Graham, you okay? How's things?
Yeah, not too bad. Really excited to hear about this. I've had that heartbreaking moment as a Australian football fan where you get really excited about a player going overseas only to see them do their ACL and out for 9 months, and then you have to wait for the next one. So I'm hoping that you can bring some solutions to this crisis that we've had for as long as I can remember.
I
So
think
why
it,
don't we start with what is a sports scientist, and what is the value of sports science for injury prevention? I know you have done a big meta-analysis, essentially on how to prevent injuries.
what is a sports scientist? Good question. So I actually like to think of a sports scientist, and this might be controversial, as a bit of a jack of all trades. Um, and by that I mean I think they tie together quite nicely all of the different disciplines across the sports sciences. So they might work with a biomechanist, a physiologist, a strength and conditioning coach, psychologist, and really oversee the holistic health of the athlete, and making sure that they are doing things safely, making sure that they are well protected, monitoring things like fatigue and recovery and how well they're recovering, um, and really just overseeing that bigger picture of, are we keeping our athletes safe whilst optimizing performance? Ultimately, that's what I see a sports scientist's role in a nutshell. The value of a sports scientist for injury, I think that the thing is, a strength and conditioning coach will be looking at this from the angle of trying to get their athletes as strong and as well conditioned as possible, but not necessarily as interested in the recovery element. So we want that adaptation, and we want those improvements, and we want athletes to develop their strength and be conditioned. But if you think about on the other side of the fence, we also want them to recover adequately for the next competitive encounter. And we want them to sleep well, and we want them to eat the right things. And we want their, psychology and well-being to be optimal as well. So the strength, the sports scientist would be very valuable for me in the sense of you have everyone pushing the athlete all the time, the coaches wanting them to work hard, and the other practitioners trying to push them. But the sports scientist for me maybe just reins that in a touch and monitors those things and says, look, we're overstretching our athletes here, and we want to ensure that they're ready for the matches, and they're prepared, and they're fully recovered. So so they're almost like the central person for me that is just trying to keep things nicely balanced.
So, tell me how big a difference it makes. So, suppose we had a complete mad prime minister who said, let's just ban all sports science in the country. They're just producing fake news. How many more injuries would we have if we just put it in hands of clubs?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's one of those questions where how long's a piece of string, but I would certainly say that without having that individual that is monitoring the athletes closely and trying to look out for their best interests and trying to optimize player availability, player readiness, as we'd call it, inevitably the number of injuries would increase, and for a number of different reasons, which I won't go into. But yeah, and we'll talk about some of the different ways injuries happen and why they might happen. But yeah, for me, sports science would be crucial for that element.
Yeah, so let's talk about how much sports science there is in the English pyramid. Because I interviewed a semi-pro uh, coach from Sunshine Coast Fire, and they talked about their sports science department, and this is already in the semi-pros. So, what's this looking like? The sports science department, if you're on, say, the Premier League, the Championship, League One, League Two, Conference, and as you go down, when does it stop, and what level of sophistication do these clubs have?
Yeah, great question. So with the English Premier League, as you can imagine, the infrastructure in place is quite impressive. Typically, you would have a head of sports science and then a number of different sports scientists working under them. Particularly if you're thinking about the higher level top six teams, they have huge budgets and they'd really make the most of those budgets, and they'd have huge teams. As you go down the pyramid and you start to move down, we would still have sports scientists in place, likely head of sports scientists. Even as you go down to the Championship, League One, League Two, potentially even Conference. Now, I've played football for a long time now, 12, 13 years in the if you think about the English pyramid and you think about Premier League, Championship, League One, League Two, Conference, and then you've got Conference North, Conference South, and then you've got 4 different divisions under that. So I've played around those kind of divisions all my career ultimately from being sort of 21, 20, 22 years old, so about 10, 15 years. And we've always had in place a head coach. This is for the last 15 years. You'd have an assistant coach and you would have a fitness coach of some description. You'd have a physiotherapist. You might even have someone that's expert in sport rehab. So even as low down as those tiers in the English pyramid, there is still some attempt to monitor athlete load and to and look out for from a medical perspective, look out for the players. So yeah, so that's just to give you a snapshot. Sports scientists are implemented 5 tiers down in the English pyramid, and even lower than that sometimes. But you certainly, if your English Premier League and Championship, there would be very clear, staffing structures in place that would look after the health and well-being of the players.
So I imagine in Australia we have pretty good sports science for other codes, right? We have Mitchell Stark, 35 years old. He's still bowling at over 140 Ks for 5 tests in a row. We have Olympians who do well. But if we get our sports scientists in Australia to give advice for our young football players or our football clubs, is there going to be a difference? Is there specialized knowledge for the sports science needed for injury prevention and optimizing performance in football compared to other codes? Or how much crossover is there?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think the thing is the principles of injury prevention, I describe them as being universal. So in other words, we want to build strength, we want to manage load, we want to move well, and we want to recover well. And that would apply to any sport, any exercise modality. But the emphasis does change by sport. So football, for instance, football players need speed. They need hamstring robustness. Whereas rugby players, the needs are different. So they might need, for instance, collision resilience, the resilience to collisions and more upper body strength. Whereas, say, an Olympic athlete, it's a very extremely individualized preparation for that particular sport, depending on what the sport would be. So it very much depends, I would say, on the demands of the different sports, and then as a consequence of that, we would then probably make bespoke recommendations. So you've almost got your generalized recommendations that would apply to all sports, your general principles, and then you might be a little bit more creative, and where the research allows you to implement those evidence-based strategies for that individual sport. That's probably the best way I could summarize, really.
So I guess the reason why all this is really interesting to me is because we seem to be very injury prone, Aussies. So Aussies, they don't get injured too much. Aussie footballers, I should say, not Aussies across all sports. They don't seem to get injured too much in the A-League or in the NPL or wherever they came for. But as soon as they go to Europe, especially if they go to England, I'd say in the first year, you're looking at maybe 2/3 of our players are having long-term injuries, soft tissue injuries in the first year. And then at any one time, I'd say about 1/3 of our players playing in Europe are injured at any one time. So just to give a bit of context about that, some of the differences which people have given us between playing in Australia versus overseas. I don't believe we have full-time conditioning coaches in our A-League clubs. We very much focus on technique. And so you have fairly scrawny players playing in the A-League and noticeable different body body shape when they go to the championship or even, the Jupiler League or the Eredivisie. And then we only play 26 weeks a year. We play in summer rather than winter, and our winters are probably hotter than your summers.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
and apparently we have much harder grounds and, of course, a much shorter season. So could any of those different factors contribute to our injury proneness? And yeah, I wanted to hear your opinion on those differences in environments and whether you think how much you think that's contributing to basically our long injury list all the time.
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely. E Practically everything you described there would increase your chances of injury, to my knowledge. So if I think about it then, so overseas, so you think about the UK and Europe, they would expect, and it certainly shows that from the practices I'm aware of, that their athletes are becoming much stronger, much younger than they ever have. Um, Now, players from the likes of Australia move overseas with potentially lower strength levels, we could say. And we know this is a proven concept that stronger players or stronger athletes tolerate loads better. And we know that when you can tolerate loads better, your chances of injury are much lesser. So if the Australian players come over to Europe and to the UK and they've not had the same physical development infrastructure in place than we do here in our sports academies, which is, as I say, it's become customary that our young athletes would have those kind of practices embedded, then there's undoubtedly cause for concern, is what I'd say. So if you think about some of the other contextual factors that you discussed, so you spoke about there that some of the surfaces are much harder, that the temperatures are much hotter, and there's potential for when they come over here. I imagine it would be such a huge shock to the system with these rapid spikes in load, and all coupled with the fact that they have this limited S&C background, strength and conditioning background, that cumulative stress that will just gather quite quickly, we would think would, inevitably there's going to be a time when, the tissues give and there's injury susceptibility. So yeah, so the short answer is that it's no surprise whatsoever, based on what you've just told me, that there are increases in injury risk as soon as the players leave Australia and start to do things, start to work towards much more intense schedules and practices that we have here.
So it sounds like you mostly emphasized the core strength and conditioning that these players had as maybe even more important as some of the other factors. I don't know if that's a false impression. Obviously, we have the length of the season, the difference in temperature and everything, and the harder pitches. But maybe building up a core is maybe even more important than that. Which, if I'm not misreading you, that's something that maybe is easier to prevent than those other factors, because we can't change our temperature or our pitches. We could lengthen the season, but there's serious financial issues about that. But maybe strength and conditioning is something that we have more control over. Is that a correct read of what you'd say, that that's probably the biggest factor?
Yes, and as you said, that's a factor that we would describe as a modifiable risk factor. So the things that we can't influence, we don't tend to worry about a great deal. We'll try where we can to put measures in place, often retrospectively, or prospectively sometimes. So for instance, if you think about heat, one of the factors that would increase injury risk would be dehydration. We know that there's some links between dehydration and injury risk. And we would try and do something around hydrating our players the best we could, but ultimately we can't change the weather, so we tend to try and give recommendations based on the things we can influence. But one of the biggest risk factors for injury ultimately is weakness, and we know that the research tells us that. So yeah, so that when I'm talking about the fact that the players are maybe not as conditioned as some of the UK European players, that for me would be one of the ways we could drastically change practice in Australia, so that when the players do come over here, they maybe don't, face these problems that they are currently.
If you had the ability to intervene with the next Harry Cure, and you can intervene with them at any age to make sure that they're going to have an injury-free as much of an injury-free career as possible. When do you want to start doing exercises, building core strength, or whatever to prepare them uh, for football? Do you want to start at 9, 13, 16? When do you start to see benefits, and when do you start to lose those benefits if you miss that time out?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's outside of my expertise, to be honest. I'm not really a youth athlete. That's not my expertise, I wouldn't say. So I don't want to be too specific here and comment. What I can do is tell you a little bit about what the current clubs do over in the UK. And they would start their athletes as young as around 12, doing some basic strength and conditioning, body weight type of exercises. So working on things like core stability would be a key one, which involves you doing certain exercises to improve, your typically you would describe it as trunk strength, but all of the limbs around there, so balance and other, coordination and those kind of exercises. But undoubtedly, there would be some work around improving lower body strength and sort of not just strength, I wouldn't say, but almost movement coordination. Um, how well we land the quality of our movement, how well we change direction, and those cutting type maneuvers. The sort of the optimizing how our players would move would be one of the strategies, as well as, so when I say strength and conditioning, I don't just mean getting in the gym, lifting weights necessarily at that age. Certainly at the younger ages, it would be all around how we improve the control, the movement control and movement quality as well as strength. So I just want to make that clear, I suppose. But in terms of age, I couldn't say what the best age would be. I would just be able to tell you roughly where we would start here in the UK would be around 12 years old, potentially even earlier. I don't know of the research that would suggest that the earlier the better. But I would say that you also wouldn't want to leave that until they get to an age where they're kind of their movement patterns and their coordination and their kind of motor control is those sort of neural pathways are set in place. You would want to do it before they kind of develop their way of moving, I suppose. So that would be my recommendation.
So in Australia, we have this theory about how to develop the technical side of the player, that the golden age is between 10 and 13 years old. That's when you get all your technical motions need to really be advanced by the age of 13. So would it be the case that because those technical motions require a lot of motion of the body, that you also want to start to get that core strength in place, at least the groundwork already by the time you're setting that technical foundation?
Yeah, that would seem quite sensible to me. That would seem like a sensible approach because the technical element, if you think about how we learn new skills, so technical skills, it would be very much that we'd work on, um, forming those neural pathways from brain to limb and brain to limb. But ultimately, physical conditioning, so we talk about strength and movement, the movement and coordination and improving those elements, those pathways are also vitally important. So you think about the jumping and landing and accelerating, all of those all of those physical qualities that we need to optimize as an athlete. You can see that those kind of patterns that we set in place, ideally, as much earlier than that when they go through adolescence and that they've so you can see that would be a sensible approach. What I would say that as we're developing the technical ability at the ages of 10 to 13, that we're alongside that we're also prioritizing some of the physical attributes too, because there's not just the technical impetus to the sport, but the physical aspects, certainly as we get into the senior squads, are becoming more and more important. So yeah, so maybe it's just a shift in culture that's needed potentially.
So suppose a young kid is say 16 years old and they didn't get that early core strength being built up, or maybe they're 17 or 18. They're starting their A League career. Is there how much can you catch up, or is there long term damage to missing out those early years and developing that core strength and those core movements and athletic development as a teenager?
It's a good question, really. One thing I will say is that one thing I'm aware of is what we would ideally want is that our athletes are conditioned to the sport quite early. So we call it early specialization. We call it, and there is evidence to suggest that if our athletes are not specialised in that sport earlier, so they start the sport later. Let's say they start the sport 16 plus. There is evidence to suggest that they are more susceptible to injuries as they compete in that sport. And ultimately, it's in some ways it's probably because they're not accustomed to the demands. So the tissues are not used to tolerating the loads of that sport. They're not used to moving in a set way. So you are ultimately inevitably playing catch up. Now that's not to say that you can't eventually get there, but you are potentially disadvantaged based on the fact that you've not done you've not done the initial conditioning work that someone that you're competing against has done. So you likely suffer as a consequence of that. There are the odd physical specimen that might defy that rule, but typically, generally speaking, we would say that we want them to specialize as early as they can in a sport.
So when I was growing up, I got told you don't do weight training until 16 because that's when your bones are ready for the weight training. I don't know if the science still supports that, but is that something which needs, if you're serious about being a footballer, what age do you want to start weight training and what sort of loads are we looking at?
Well, actually, the evidence on so I've heard this said many a times that resistance training would potentially stunt growth and have other implications for your bones, for instance. Now, I'm not aware that the research is that conclusive in that area. So all we recommend is that any of the resistance training that you are doing as an athlete um, is as safe as it can be, um, and that potentially we are very much considering, like we are being considerate that younger athletes might have, they are still growing ultimately, and their bones are still forming. So we wouldn't recommend that you lift heavy weights, but it would be very much a progressive increase, in those early years. Again, I'm not qualified enough to comment on specific ages or when that might be. But we would certainly say that we would want them to start under close supervision from someone who is in tune with, young athletes and resistance training. We'd want there to be a very strong emphasis on maintaining technique and not maximizing loads. It wouldn't be all about weight by any means. It would be very much on technique-based training. The gradual progression would be very important. So we're not rushing ahead to lift huge weights. It's very much a progressive increase, starting from a foundational level, getting that technique in place. Making sure that the exercise are age appropriate, for instance. We're not doing anything too sophisticated that would challenge them too much. And then also maybe be mindful of that we don't need to be loading them up 5 times a week. It might only be twice a week to start with, once or twice a week, progressing towards 3 times a week, and that we're giving them plenty of time for all of that additional growing to take place. So we're not taking away the energy from growing. We want them to continue to grow. So we've just got to it's a bit more balanced maybe when they're younger, and we've got to proceed with more caution. But there's no reason, and the evidence doesn't tell us that there's any reason why younger athletes can't perform resistance training exercises across a season.
Suppose that you're in Australia and you're with either an A-League academy or you're with a NPL academy. If you're with an A-League academy, I believe, once you're in the senior team, you're doing 6 training sessions a week, 2 to 4 hours each. And the NPL, you're doing about 3 training sessions a week. To 4. I think 4 is the highest. And I've heard of stories of some players getting personal advice, trying to get into the gym and trying to lift weights. But from what I look at the body types, most aren't doing that. How much of this sort of weight training and athletic development and going into the gym could you learn just by looking at online and getting advice from your coaches? And how much do you really need that full-time strength and conditioning coaches that you're clubs.
Yeah, so you've got to be very, very careful taking advice from people online, because ultimately it doesn't take a lot now to claim that you are a fully qualified strength and conditioning coach. I suppose a basic personal training qualification could, I'm not overly, I'm not into social media myself very much, but I imagine there are people claiming to be certified and accredited where they're not, or misleading people that maybe are not that aware of the guidelines, etc. So I would be very cautious on taking advice from someone that claims to be a strength conditioning coach online. Um, Having said that, there are probably people out there that are as qualified as someone that's working within that's qualified to work with with athletes, and that's got the professional accreditations. Um, so I'm not going to say that don't listen to anyone. Maybe use your own kind of wisdom and your own kind of knowledge, and maybe take something that you hear with a pinch of salt. But yeah, there will be some good strength and conditioning resources online to follow. And what you have to understand is that typically it would be that um, we can follow certain guidelines of the likes of the American College of Sports Medicine. The clear guidelines in place. There will be some kind of video-based resources online that are useful. But we would always recommend following advice from someone that would be ultimately qualified and in the position of a strength and conditioning coach in an organization. So just the message for me is just to proceed with caution when taking advice from anyone that we're unsure about.
So, do you know roughly what sort of loads we're looking at on top of the training loads at different ages that say if you're Manchester United or the Championship club, how many hours we're expecting in the gym or in core work or anything?
Yeah, are you talking here for youth athletes, or what's the kind of
Yeah,
who
youth,
you?
adult, as you go up the ages, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's there's so much to this question, but just very basically, really, I'd say that if you think about younger athletes, they maybe only train for certainly here in the academies, um, 1 or 2 evenings a week, and then they would play a match on a weekend. That tends to be how it is at the younger age groups, and rightly so, because there is the recovery at that age is vital when they're reaching what we call peak height velocity. So when they're growing their quickest, we need them to be recovering, and sleeping and eating. Those kind of elements are as important as the actual training that they're doing. So we would say a couple of 2 or 3 times a week training and playing, etc. Now, as athletes sort of move out of the peak height velocity age and they move into sort of like 17, 18-year-old, um, we could increase those workloads, and we might look to typically athletes at that age would train quite a lot. They've got plenty of energy at that age, as I'm sure you're aware of. Um, and at that age, we probably would have them train. If they're full time athletes, 3 or 4 days a week for you know an hour and a half, 90 minutes roughly, and then play once on a weekend. And then as they get towards senior levels, it tends to be that competition. You get to an age then where you might start to most of your load would be around competition rather than training per se. So it tends to be then that pre-seasons are intense, certainly over here, the football pre-seasons, and we would have athletes in training quite considerably higher in terms of the workloads, the outputs, than they would during the season. So we almost we're preparing them, or over preparing them in many ways. But then once the season starts, we would have them train once or twice a week, probably twice a week, one of them a really light session, and then 1 or 2 matches a week as well. So when you get older and you typically are working with squads anywhere here between 18 and 35, 36-year-old, you've got to also be mindful of those older athletes that maybe need more downtime and more rest time. For obvious reasons, they're getting older and stiffer and less capable, etc. So yeah, so across the pathway, it tends to be that I would say that the younger athletes, we have to be mindful of them from a growth perspective. And then as they move towards like the teen years, we tend to let them loose a little bit more. And then as they go towards senior levels, we're managing those loads very carefully, and only sort of hammering them at the right times, mainly pre-season. And when they might have a one match week is when they get the loads are pushed higher, really.
So suppose you don't do best practice, because at the moment I'm assuming that we're not doing a lot of that in Australia. And you get signed, you get your big club, you sign for Portsmouth, which seems to be one that keeps signing Australian players, which get injured within a week of getting there for years sometimes. Uh, suppose Portsmouth sign another Aussie, or some other championship club signs an Aussie. They haven't had that years of developing their core strength or doing that strength and conditioning, but they do have a good technical base. They understand the game well, and you feel like that if they had that, they could be on the level. What advice would you give both to the player and the club to help them make that transition without getting injured?
Yes, it's a really good question, and one thing I will say is there's more than just the strength and conditioning. There's more that would come with it for me. So yes, we would try to gradually increase their strength and conditioning. Um, you know, uh, can't think of the word output. We would try and condition them in the gym and on the training field, but we would have to do it gradually, and we'd have to do it in a smart way as possible, I suppose. But there's also a piece here, I think, around um, education and trying to, because the thing is, you don't realize how much you learn when you're constantly in the gym, working with strength conditioning coaches, and it becomes part of your everyday routines and your practices for a number of years. You become quite educated as one, self-educated in terms of what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and then just in terms of the actual field of strength and conditioning and how we would best practices ultimately. So it's not just about hammering them in the gym, but also educating them on everything from strength conditioning to nutrition to sleep to hydration. So there's a bigger piece that goes around it for me as well. Um, so yeah, so there's quite a bit that's involved here, but I think that for me it would be a making sure that the spike or the training that we give them is a gradual increase, and making sure that we're giving them loads of advice and loads of support here on how they would be recovering adequately outside of training, because it would be a huge change to it would be it would be a shock to the body ultimately, and we need to. We're asking for trouble if we throw them in with the current squads that are training, and they've always been used to training that way, without giving them any form of education or without periodizing their training, but in a bespoke way, but and very carefully and cautiously.
So another issue which comes up a lot with Australia is we play in Asia, which is spans, I think, quite a few time zones. So Saudi Arabia is maybe only a couple of hours away from England in terms of time zone, and then Australia is, as you can imagine, if you're a cricket fan, many hours apart. So there is always been a concern, especially when one of our high-profile players gets injured after flying out to play in China or Japan or whatever, or the Middle East, and then fly back to their clubs and they get injured either during the trip or after the trip, that jet lag and the travel has something to do with that. Is there any data to support that? And if so, is there anything that can be done to try and minimize that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. There is research to suggest that, for instance, disrupted sleep is a predictor of injury in sport. So there is something there with travel, and travel we know disrupts sleep, travel across different time zones and the potential hormonal changes that can result from that. Um, and ultimately, we know that fatigue is a huge predictor of injury. So if you think that you're more fatigued, you might have slower reactions, for instance, and not be able to avoid a tackle or an encounter of some description. It can lead when we're fatigued. We know it leads to poorer movement quality, reduced muscle activation, change in decision making. So there's a number of different factors that will be influenced by the fatigue from the potential travel that could have a real problem in terms of increasing our injury output. And then if you also think about the fact that you're traveling quite frequently, it's likely that your hydration and nutrition it will be influenced because you might miss meal, for instance. You might not have the access to fluids during some of these flights. It might be that there's almost like your preparation's not optimal, I suppose, for matches, and you just don't have access to your usual routine. Um, so these kind of things can influence, all kinds of different elements around sort of even think about like stiffness, for instance, or reduced mobility, tightness in the hip flexors because you sat down for long periods. You can just see how there's there's a number of different factors that can almost all accumulate to just an environment where the margins matter, by the way, because you're constantly being pushed. That could be just a factor that tips you over the edge. So again, uh, travel and lack of all of the shortfalls that come with that, you can see how that can interrupt your training cycle and result in injury.
So if you had an Aussie working for a club that you're working with that just came back from China or Japan or whatever on a international window, played 2 matches in 2 different time zones, what would you tell the club to try and help manage bringing them back into the English time zone?
Yeah, it's a $1 million question, and there's probably some ways we can go about doing this, but I think one of the things is that there's some evidence to suggest that if let's say that you will have a very intense travel schedule approaching, there's some evidence to suggest that if you can almost get sleep in the bank, so you can sleep more before you go and travel, that will ultimately have a positive influence. So let's say if you have 2 groups, one of them was to go into the travel schedule, um, maybe slightly sleep deprived, versus another group that was very well rested, very well slept. There's some evidence to suggest that that particular group would benefit from that. So that would be one thing I said to them, is to get as much sleep as you can before you go and travel, and that will have some impact. I would say that in terms of when they're traveling, can we look at things like some of the sleep hygiene practices that they're undertaking? So, for instance, just some things that spring to mind here would be using eye masks. They're trying to block out the light. Neck pillows, for instance. Maybe potentially start to adjust bedtimes quickly when you return from travel. So try and get back to bedtime as quick as you can. We want you to be in as consistent a routine as possible. Keep the room dark and cool and quiet. Use, maybe where possible, try to, limit light exposure. All those kind of factors really that can help. We'd also recommend them when they come back into the normal routines. I'd describe this as hydrating aggressively. So almost drinking more than you would otherwise and becoming as hydrated as you possibly can is how I would, is another factor that could support them, that could help them. Also, they want to, in these times, if you think about nutrition, they want to be taking snacks with them, so like the likes of protein bars, things that are easily, that will help with recovery, but that are easily accessible, I'd say, and you can maybe take in flight. Avoiding any underfueling, a key one. When athletes are traveling, we know they underfuel when they travel excessively. So making sure that they're eating plenty of, getting plenty of calories in would be a big one. And yeah, just all of the sort of the stretching, mobility type exercises will be key. We get them doing those because we know that you stiffen up when you travel. So they're just a few strategies I could think that we would implement around those busy travel schedules.
So, final topic. So, the women's game is developing at lightning speed. We now have professionalization of women's game. We have longer seasons. We have more international games and tournaments, which we're taking a lot more seriously. And there's been a bit of an anxiety about all the ACLs, which are happening, anterior cruciate ligament strains, which are happening, that maybe we don't understand the sports science well enough for how to manage and prevent injuries in women. Is there some truth in that? Is there still a lot of development to be done in understanding the sports science of the women's game, or is it just a matter of putting practices which are known in place?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's very much a topical area of sports science at the moment. The fact that women are more susceptible to injuries, and in particular, as you described there, the ACL injury. And there's a number of different reasons for that. And there are actually some research going on in my department at the moment, at Manchester Metropolitan University, the Institute of Sport, that is looking at this particular problem. There are PhDs on this area at the moment. Now, as you alluded to there, we know that women are, have different biological and hormonal um, you know, factors. There are a number of different things around, like they have like a wider pelvis, for instance, and the knee alignment, we call it the Q angle. The knees ultimately are slightly more inverted than what a male would be, which of course we know that typically an ACL injury occurs because of those internal forces that are applied to the knee. When there's like an intense movement of some kind, I describe it as. So that would, so we're confident that I think the data shows us that the female athletes suffer ACL injuries around six times more likely to suffer an ACL injury than the male counterpart. So it really is a problem. Um, so yeah, so one thing we would say is that currently the female game of football, certainly we could say, um, just isn't comparable to the men's game, in the sense that they don't have the resources that the men's game do, and they don't have the strength and conditioning support, even at the highest level, but certainly at the younger academy level. And it's ultimately a similar kind of problem as what we've already discussed, is that they don't have the strength and conditioning infrastructure in place when they're younger, ultimately. Now, and what tends to happen is in the female game is that they are constantly, because there's just such a vast amount of research done on male football players, essentially the females get treated as often smaller males without factoring in the fact that they are very different in their anatomy, in their physiology, in term from a hormonal perspective, they're very different. So much of the research that's been proved to be effective in male players is then applied to the females without considering all of these other factors. So yeah, ultimately that's one of the reasons why. There's also some suggestions that females at different stages of the menstrual cycle, this research is not overly well established yet, but that the knee ligaments, for instance, are much more lax at different phases of the cycle, and that they're more susceptible to injury, and certainly ACL injuries, at certain phases of the cycle. So potentially there's some implications around, do we ask them to do their more intense training at various stages of the cycle to avoid, loading them too much when then ligaments might be slightly more lax, for instance. So there's still a lot of research ongoing in this area, and there's still loads of work that needs to be done around sort of looking at how they respond differently to strength training protocols and neuromuscular training, and how we can potentially look at fatigue management in females, and how we can implement practices around adjusting their training schedule, for instance. And then ultimately it comes down to better youth development practices that are put in place, so that when they get to these senior levels, they again have they're adequately trained to be able to deal with those additional demands. Because you can see that the women's game now, certainly in the UK, is becoming very commercialized, and that's leading to more and more fixtures, which is more and more load on and demand on the players. And all that's going to happen is this problem is going to continue to become an even bigger issue than it already is, if we don't do something about the female, about the problem with the females not being adequately prepared for this, the fixture congested schedules that they're currently been starting to be exposed to.
Plenty of food for thought there, whether you're a fan, whether you're a player with ambition, whether male or female, or club, or grassroots coach, or I hope that I hope this has opened up a big conversation, and please feel to contribute on the forum, greenandgoldfc.com. Don't forget, we're also on Twitter, Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Please hit that like and subscribe button. That's all we have time for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, it's bye for now.